Mortdog just released his patch 13.20 rundown for all the major changes that are coming in the next patch. And the purpose of this video is to give you an idea on how those changes are likely to affect the meta. So first, let's start off with a snapshot of what the 13.19 meta looks like at this current moment in time. In S tier, we have Ionia Vanquishers, Nilah Flex. This is where you play double RFC GS Nilah, maybe scoped weapons. You have Sejuani and Jarvan as your primary tanks. Add a Scion, add Bilgewater units, and there's your main comp. You have Cho'Gath Reroll. You have Demonflare Swain with 6 Sorc. In A tier, we have Neeko Reroll. This is S tier if you have Double Trouble or Woodishtal. Piltover Gunners, still very strong in the early game. Multicasters, Vertical Noxus with Mordekaiser. Cassiopeia carry if you reroll for Cassiopeia. Rogue Reroll, still very good. Vertical Demacia, this is more of a fringe A tier comp where if you're able to hit Demacia +1 on Mordekaiser and can play 7 Demacia for Slayer, that's very strong. Doesn't happen in a whole lot of games. And then this is the Chinese Void reroll strategy where if you get Void +1, you throw it on Talia, reroll all your Voids, have a very strong Rift Herald. In B tier, we have Sorcs, mostly because it's reliant on hitting Ahri. We also have Azir Silco. There's a lot of conditions that are required for this comp to be strong. Like you need good items on Azir, good items on Silco. You need to fully itemize Azir, Silco, and Nasus, which can be very difficult to do if you don't have item augments. So there's a lot of conditions for making this work. And as a result of that, it's B tier. We have Kayle Reroll, B tier because of the tempo that's required in order to make this comp work. The earlier you hit Kayle and can go to level 6, the better it is. Ravenous Hunter, B tier because you need very specific items for the Warwick. And then finally we have Bilgewater, B tier because you need to have Rising Infamy or Bilgewater +1 and a good Bilgewater opener for this to really work out. But it can be good if all of those conditions or some of those conditions are met. And then in C tier, we have challengers. There's just too many specific conditions that are required to make challengers work. You need very good combat augments, ideally 3 of them. You need to have Kai'Sa 2, Fiora 2 in stage 4 most of the time in order to stabilize. It's just a lot of conditions that are unrealistic to meet. But if you have all of those conditions, it is very playable. It can even go first still if you have God tier augments and are able to hit Kai'Sa 2, Fiora 2 in stage 4. But that's a lot of ifs. So there's the current snapshot of the current meta. Now let's go into what I think is going to change. Here is the updated patch 13.20 tier list that I have put together. Now I'm going to focus first on some of the major changes that are happening in this patch. So first of all, Ionia Vanquishers was an S tier comp. Now it's moving down into A tier. Why is it moving down into A tier? Well, they did a number of different nerfs. Number one, they nerfed the Ionia emblem. So usually you would try to get an Ionia emblem on Nilah or Ashe 3, and they reduced the attack speed by quite a bit on that Ionia emblem. That's going to have a pretty large impact on the strength of having Ionia emblem as a +1. They also nerfed 6 Vanquisher. So 6 Vanquisher was very strong. That was part of why taking +1 Vanquisher still had pretty good stats. It was always weaker than +1 Ionia, but it was still viable. Well, now it's a lot weaker. So in fact, it's so much weaker that +1 Vanquisher, I would not be surprised if it has pretty bad stats in the next patch. The other thing that they did is they did a pretty heavy-handed nerf to Set. They nerfed his max mana by quite a bit. So they went from 90 to 110. And as a result of that, he's going to cast a lot less frequently. This basically kills the boss augment and also just makes Set a much worse tank in 6 Ionia before you're able to hit Shen 2. And that is going to have a pretty big impact on the early game for Vanquishers. And then lastly, I guess we have the Xayah nerf. The main thing here is that her starting mana is lower. So she's going to get that first cast off later in the fight. That matters because her cast will sunder her target. And a lot of Ionia Vanquishers was about the burst potential at the start of a fight. So we're going to see the burst of Ionia Vanquishers be a lot less than it was before. And you're also taking away some of the tankiness from Set. So you combine those two things together and yeah, I mean, it's generally just going to be a weaker comp in the early game, mid game, and late game. And so it's either going to be A tier or somewhere in B tier. I'm going to put it in A tier for now. Next up, we have Nilah Flex. There was no changes at all to this comp. So they did not nerf Nilah. They did not nerf scoped weapons. They did not nerf RFC. They made no changes that mattered for the comp, and they actually buffed Nautilus and they buffed Gangplank's AI. And these are units that you would consider playing in the comp. So Nilah Flex looking to be very strong. Demonflare also completely unchanged. So no changes made to the augment, no changes made to any sorks. So 6 sork Demonflare still in S tier. Cho'Gath Reroll. So the big thing with Cho'Gath Reroll, it's moved down from S tier to A tier. There are 2 main reasons for this. Number 1 is they did a minor nerf to Cho'Gath, where now at 3 stars you only get 35 HP per kill as opposed to 40 HP. Now they buffed the 1-star version from 30 to 35, so it's just flat 35 across all star levels. However, the 3-star version is more important, so this is going to decrease the amount of HP your Cho'Gath has in the late game. By exactly how much is hard to tell, but something worth noting. The other thing of note here is that they decrease Cassiopeia's spell damage by roughly 6%. So Cassiopeia was the premier carry for stage 2, stage 3, and if you had 3-starred her, it would be stage 4, 5, 6, and so on, until you're able to actually carry like a 5-cost 2-star or something crazy like that. So Cassiopeia was the premier carry for the comp. Getting nerfed by 6% will be noticed. Outside of that, there was a buff to Rek'Sai in terms of how she deals damage to the front line, and a nerf to how she deals damage to the back line. In this comp, I think it's more important that she deals damage to the front line, so I think it's overall a buff. And there's a chance that you'll see Rek'Sai as a secondary carry a little bit more often. We'll see whether or not that ends up being true. So that's it for the S tier changes. So 2 comps got demoted out of S tier. That's Cho'Gath Reroll and Ionia Vanquishers. Now 2 comps got promoted into S tier, and that would be Piltover Gunners and Multicasters. So Piltover Gunners got promoted into S tier because, number 1, they buffed Aphelios by 10% on his AD. That's a big deal for Gunners because the way that Gunners work is they scale off of your base AD. It's a percentage of your base AD, so you're just going to continue to get more and more AD on the Aphelios. You're just going to do 10% more damage, probably even potentially more when you scale them with items and go more vertical in the Gunner trait. So they made the 4-cost carry of Piltover Gunners even stronger, and I think that's just generally going to be enough to boost the comp up to S tier. The truth is, if you have Piltover on 2-1, it's already pretty strong right now. I would say it's close to S tier, so I think this is enough to push it up to S tier now. Multicasters are currently in A tier. I promoted them to S tier here. They made a lot of changes to multicasters. So the first thing of note is that they do not get multiple casts anymore. Well, they get 1 additional cast, but when you go up to 4, they're no longer getting that second additional cast. That's a pretty big deal for somebody like Taliyah that gets a lot of benefit out of that extra cast. Not only is it extra CC, but it's also an extra knockup, which means an extra use of her passive. So Taliyah in particular is pretty heavily nerfed by the multicaster change. However, the other changes that they made to the multicasters, I believe, will offset this. So they did a lot of different things. First of all, they did a 10% buff to Taliyah's damage. That will partially offset the multicaster change. They made a massive change to Sona, where she will do a lot more damage to her first target. That might sound like a nerf because now it does less damage to subsequent targets, which it didn't before. But the thing is, there were a lot of fights where Sona would be your last unit alive, and now she can actually win that 1v1. That's a pretty big deal. Also, her you can position her second from the corner now as opposed to in the corner, and it will buff your unit that's in the corner. That's huge. And it has a permanent stacking attack speed buff. That is also huge. So actually, to be honest with you, that one's a little bit less huge because multicaster fights are decided very quickly. So like scaling is not something that's really that important, I don't think, in multicasters, but it's still a nice change. And then there is a 5% nerf to TF that they did, but they also buffed how quickly it takes for his card to explode. So all in all, I think multicasters are buffed. It's very hard to tell, though. It's very hard to tell. This is something that's just going to require playing the game in order to figure it out. So I think they'll be S tier, but they may be B tier. Like this one I could be wildly wrong about because there were so many changes that they made at once. So that's why we have multicasters in S tier. Next up, we have Noxus. Now, Noxus is still in A tier, hasn't changed. There were 2 minor changes that they made for Noxus. First of all, they buffed Total Domination. so that the execute is sooner now. So that should make it a little bit more noticeable when you take total domination, but that's only one augment, so only affects the comp by so much. And then the other thing is that they fixed the crit bug with Mordekaiser. I don't even fully understand how the crit bug worked. I just knew that JG on Mordekaiser had really high delta, which suggests it was very bad, which means that he was not getting the amount of crit that he was supposed to get. So now apparently that interaction works better. So now you can actually put a JG onto Mordekaiser or play Jeweled Lotus maybe or something like that, and not get punished too much for it. So that could be like, it's a slight buff, but there's no major changes to Noxus. Next up, we have Rogue Reroll. So I wanted to talk about the fact that this actually got demoted from A tier down to B tier, could even be arguably in C tier. So the major changes that they made here is they nerfed the amount of damage that 4 rogues do. Their bleed damage went from 60% to 55%. They nerfed Graves AD by 10%, pretty much across the board, 1-star, 2-star, 3-star. And that's a pretty big deal as well, because Graves was what kept you stable until you were able to get into the late game. So Graves right now, he's pretty important. He's pretty fundamental for getting you to level 7 eventually. And this 10% nerf is going to have a huge impact on rogues. And then lastly, they nerfed Vampiric Blades. Now, Vampiric Blades was very, very strong, arguably too strong. So this is probably a justified nerf. But when you combine it with the other changes that they made, yeah, it's a pretty big deal having Vampiric Blades get nerfed. So it's definitely in B tier. You could argue maybe even C tier now for Rogue Reroll. Next up, we have Vertical Demacia. Vertical Demacia is unchanged, still in A tier. There have been a number of changes here. So the first thing is that Fiora got reworked. The major change is that she no longer becomes untargetable. She now just takes 30% less damage. Part of why I think this might be okay in Vertical Demacia as opposed to Challengers, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, is because in Vertical Demacia, you get a lot of defensive stats from Demacia itself. So now this change to Fiora might actually turn her into like a drain tank of sorts, because she will cast more often. She'll do more damage because they compensate buffed her in order to compensate for the fact that they took away her untargetability. So in Demacia particularly, the Fiora change might actually be good because it might just be an additional tank now, like a drain tank. The other thing is that there was a Sona buff. The Sona change might be pretty big, especially in Kayle Reroll, where you're giving a stackingly increased attack speed bonus. Obviously very strong in Kayle Reroll, still probably pretty good with Mordekaiser as your carry, or even Quinn as your carry. So those changes might be good. And then lastly, they nerfed Petricite Shackles. But net, I still think that this comp will be relatively like fringe A tier. Not played that often, but still pretty solid. Void Reroll. Okay, so Void Reroll actually got some slight modifications here. The big thing is that there is a 3 multicaster breakpoint that was added to the game. And that is actually pretty important because if you get Void +1 on 6, you're going to play 2 multicaster, and you really don't have anything that impactful to add on 7. But now you do, because now you can add a 3rd multicaster and just get your Talia 3 and your Vel'Koz 3 ideally to be much stronger, assuming you can even roll for those things if multicaster ends up being S tier. But that can be very impactful. And then also the 10% damage buff to Talia is very impactful because there's a lot of knockups in the Void comp. And so, yeah, I actually expect this comp to... There is potential for it to be S tier if you're able to hit Void Emblem on 2-1 or 3-2. Then we have Vertical Bilgewater. So this one might come as a surprise. I actually don't know that this will be an A tier. There's a good chance that it isn't. My argument for why it could be an A tier is, number 1, they did a major buff to Nautilus. Number 2, they did a buff to 5 Bilgewater, which is a good transition point from 5 to 7. And then they buffed GP's AI. And then arguably they nerfed, so it's kind of a nerf for TF in terms of that he does less damage and he has a higher mana pool. But they changed the delay in his spell activation, which should make it work better with Bilgewater. So it may be a buff for TF in Bilgewater. It's hard to really say for sure. But the big thing is the Nautilus buff is big. and then the 5 Bilgewater buff is big. So that might be enough to push it into A tier, because now your mid game is going to be a lot stronger. And already the stats for Nautilus 3, MF3 have already been like really solid. It's just that getting to that point has been very difficult. So maybe the change for Nautilus will make that a little bit easier to achieve. So there's a chance that this is A tier. I'm not so certain about that, but there's a chance. All right, Neeko Reroll. So the big change that they made here with Neeko Reroll is they nerfed Soraka's healing by 10%, and they also nerfed Neeko's shielding by roughly 10%. So the two of those things together, it may not sound like a whole lot, but it takes a lot of the sustain out of the comp. And the whole idea behind the comp is that if your opponent doesn't have enough single target damage to kill the Neeko, they're not killing anything unless they overtime cheese you, but that's it, right? So when you take away 10% healing and 10% shielding for the most important unit that exists in the comp, what's going to happen is the threshold for killing the Neeko is going to be much lower, and I expect that we're going to see many more compositions being able to kill the Neeko. That's why it's down to B tier here. However, if you still have Double Trouble, if you have Wood Ishtal, I suspect that those two things are still enough to make it B tier or A tier or even S tier. Honestly, I still think Double Trouble Neeko will still be S tier. We talked about Graves, or we talked about Rogue Reroll. Sorks unchanged for the most part. The only thing they really did was that they buffed the 1 cost, so they buffed Orianna and they buffed Malzahar. So the early game for Sorks will be a little bit better, but the truth is the early game for Sorks was never the issue, because 3 Void opener with Sorks is actually pretty strong. You really don't struggle in stage 2 or even stage 3. It's when you get into stage 4 and people start having really strong tanks and you aren't able to kill the backline and you don't have enough single target to kill the front line that Sorks becomes an issue. And they did nothing to address that at all. So Sorks is still in the same spot as it was before. Slightly better earlier game. You might see more people playing it as like a transitionary thing for other comps. But yeah, Sorks as an end game comp really hasn't changed at all. Azir Silco, same thing. There was really just 2 changes, I guess, that are worth noting, but they're pretty fringe. The first thing is the binary items or binary airdrop nerf, where it doesn't give a component now with the prismatic. The only reason this is relevant is because this comp actually struggles to itemize every single one of its champions. So binary airdrop was one of its best augments. And unfortunately, nerfing that augment makes it a little bit worse in all of the comps that it's good for. The other thing is that they buffed 4 Shurima, 6 Shurima, and 9 Shurima. So if you have like a Shurima spat and you're playing 4 Shurima, maybe this is a little bit better. But again, that's also a fringe scenario. So we're leaving it in B tier here. Kayle is a little bit more difficult for deciding whether or not this is a good, like whether or not this will actually move up. So it did, in my opinion, it got buffed. There are a couple of things that changed. Number 1, Petricite Shackles got nerfed. That does suck, but if you get Petricite Shackles, you're still pretty happy, probably. The Sona rework is the major thing. Now Sona will give a permanently stacking attack speed buff to adjacent units as well as units that it hits with the Crescendo. So you can put Kayle in the corner and Sona right next to Kayle, and allow the Sona to just continually permanently stack up your Kayle. I don't know if that's enough to push it into A tier. I'm not even sure if that interaction is going to be good enough to use, but it is interesting. And then we have Ravenous Hunter here in B. The big thing is Set got nerfed, but Nautilus buff is probably pretty big because you can actually use your tank items on Nautilus if you have any tank items in the early game that you're not sure what to do with. There was also some overcharge Zaun buffs. So there are some circumstances where you would play for Zaun, and those changes can actually be pretty impactful. The other major note here is that the Aatrox Darken buff got nerfed. So it's pretty important in a comp like Ravenous Hunter where you want to have the Aatrox buff on the Warwick because you're basically playing 1 unit anyway. And so the Darken nerf that they put in is going to affect Ravenous Hunter a little bit more than other comps that play Aatrox. And then I have this unknown category. So let's start off with something that was in the prior tier list. So Fiora, Kai'Sa, Challengers. I think this comp is dead. I don't know for sure that the comp is dead, but I suspect it's dead. And here's why. Fiora going infinite was a key part of the Challenger comp. She is no longer going to be able to go infinite with the change that they made to her ability. She is now targetable during her ability. I don't even think she resets aggro, and 30% damage reduction is, I'm pretty certain, nowhere near close to enough to ensure that she's able to survive. In fact, she barely survived as is before she was able to ult each time. So yeah, I have a feeling that Fiora is just going to fall over like a wet noodle if you play her in the Challenger comp and not Vertical Demacia. And as a result of that, given that she was the pillar of the Challenger comp, I'm pretty sure this comp is dead. On top of that, they also nerfed Gifts from the Fallen, which they needed to do, but this comp was so dependent on Gifts from the Fallen as one of your augments that, yeah, I'm pretty sure Challengers is dead. So I'll start off there. I'm leaving it in the unknown category because it's possible it's still C tier, but I have a feeling it's dead. These ones are actually unknown. So first of all, this is just playing Gunners without Piltover. I have no idea how strong this would be. It is like, I would say like B or C tier right now if you wanted to play Gunners without Piltover, but it might actually be viable now with the Aphelios change. Not totally sure on that one, so that's an unknown. Vertical Shurima, this is the second patch in a row that they've buffed Vertical Shurima at 4, 6, and 9. So I'm curious to see if that's enough in order to make Vertical Shurima an actual playable comp. And then lastly, they did a small buff to 6 Invoker. I'm pretty sure that's not going to make it playable. So the old Invokers comp where you played 3-star Karma as your primary carry, probably not going to be that good, even in this patch. And there's my that's my take on the changes that they're making for patch 13.20. I hope that this video was helpful for you in terms of planning your climb for day 1 of the new patch. I will have an actual tier list that comes out that's using data after the patch has probably been out for maybe like 48 hours or so. And I've had some chances to play games and actually see other people play games. But this is my preliminary thoughts on where I think we're going to go. If you like this type of content, I hope you subscribe. And I stream every day on Twitch at GM_blue. So I hope you check out my channel there. See you next time.